I was holding a stack of papers my father said were worthless. He told me to throw them away. My sister was counting cash on the kitchen table. $50,000. My parents stood behind her smiling. Nobody looked at me. I folded the documents and walked out of the room. They had no idea what I just took. 3 days earlier, my grandfather died. He was 92. He raised me more than my parents ever did. When I was 8 and my sister was 5, my parents started traveling for work. They were gone for months at a time. My grandfather moved in. He cooked my meals. He helped with homework. He taught me how to drive. My sister barely remembers him. She was always at sleepovers or with friends. But I was there every single day. The funeral was small. My parents cried. My sister cried. I didn't, not because I wasn't sad, but because I already cried alone in my car the night before. I didn't want to share that moment with people who barely visited him. After the funeral, we all went back to my parents' house. My father said we need to talk about the estate. I sat down. My sister sat down. My mother brought tea. My father pulled out a folder. He said, "Your grandfather left some things behind." I said, "Okay." He said, "There's about 50,000 in cash." My sister's eyes got wide. I stayed quiet. My father said, "We've decided to give it all to your sister." I looked at him. I said, "All of it?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because she needs it more." I said, "For what?" My mother jumped in. She said, "Your sister is starting her business. She needs capital. You have a stable job. You're fine." I asked what kind of business. My sister said, "A boutique." I said, "You don't know anything about retail." She said, "I'll learn." I said, "With whose money?" She said, "With this money." I looked at my parents. I said, "So I get nothing?" My father said, "Don't be selfish. This isn't about you." I said, "It's grandfather's money." He said, "And we're distributing it how we see fit." I asked if grandfather left a will. My father said no. I said, "How do you know?" He said, "Because I went through everything." I said, "Can I see?" He said, "There's nothing to see. Just some old documents. Property deeds from 50 years ago. Stock certificates that expired. Paperwork that doesn't matter anymore." I said, "Can I have them?" He said, "Why?" I said, "Because they were his." My mother said, "You're being difficult." I said, "I just want something that was his." My father sighed. He left the room. He came back with a manila envelope. He dropped it on the table. He said, "Here, take it. It's all garbage anyway." I picked it up. I looked inside. There were papers. Lots of them. I said, "Thank you." My sister rolled her eyes. She said, "You always have to make everything about you." I stood up. I said, "Congratulations on your $50,000. I hope your boutique works out." She said, "It will." I said, "Good." Then I left. I heard my mother say to my father, "Why does she always act like this?" I didn't wait to hear his answer. I sat in my car for 10 minutes. I opened the envelope. I started looking through the papers. There were old property deeds like my father said. Stock certificates. Bank statements from the 70s. Letters. I didn't understand most of it. But something felt wrong. My grandfather was organized. He kept everything. If he kept these documents, there was a reason. I drove home. I spread everything out on my dining table. I started organizing by date. The oldest document was from 1968. A property deed for a house in Oregon. I didn't know my grandfather owned property in Oregon. The deed had his name and someone else's name. A woman. I didn't recognize her. There were more deeds. One in California. One in Washington. All from the 60s and 70s. All with the same woman's name. I searched for her online. Nothing came up. I looked through more papers. I found a stock certificate from 1975. It was for a company I'd never heard of. The certificate said 1,000 shares. I kept digging. I found bank statements from an account I didn't know existed. The last statement was from 2008. It showed a balance of $32,000. I searched for the bank. It was still operating. I found a phone number. I called. I explained the situation. The representative said she couldn't give me information without proper authorization. I said, "I understand." She said if there's an account it would still be active. I said, "Even after this long?" She said, "Yes. Dormant but active." I hung up. I felt my heart racing. I looked through more papers. I found a letter. It was dated 2009. It was from a law firm. It was addressed to my grandfather. It said, "We are following up regarding the estate planning documents you requested. Please contact us at your earliest convenience to finalize. I searched for the law firm. They were still in business. I called. I asked to speak with someone about an old client. They transferred me. A man answered. I explained who I was. I said my grandfather passed away and I found a letter from your firm. He asked for my grandfather's name. I told him. He said hold on. He came back 2 minutes later. He said yes, we have a file. I said what kind of file? He said estate planning. I said did he finalize anything? He said I can't discuss details over the phone. I said I'm his granddaughter. He said I understand but I need verification. Can you come in? I said when? He said tomorrow if possible. I said I'll be there. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about the properties, the bank account, the law firm. My father said there was nothing. He said it was all garbage. But he was wrong. Or he was lying. The next morning I drove to the law firm. It was 2 hours away. I brought the envelope. I brought my ID. I brought my grandfather's death certificate. The lawyer met me in a conference room. His name was Richard. He was older, maybe 60. He said I remember your grandfather. Good man. I said thank you. He opened a file. He said he came to us in 2009. He wanted to set up a trust. I said a trust for what? He said for his assets. I said what assets? He pulled out papers. He said he owned 3 properties. 1 in Oregon, 1 in California, 1 in Washington. I said are they still in his name? He said yes. I said what are they worth? He said we'd need current appraisals but based on location probably around 900,000 combined. I felt dizzy. I said 900,000. He said yes, maybe more. Real estate in those areas has gone up significantly. I said did he finalize the trust? He said no, he came in for the consultation. We drafted documents, but he never signed. I said why not? He said I don't know. He stopped responding to our calls. I asked if there was anything else. He said yes. He had a brokerage account. I said with who? He gave me the name of the firm. I wrote it down. He said according to his records from 2009 it was worth about 70,000. I said in stocks. He said yes. I said that's stocks. He said I don't have that information. You'd need to contact the brokerage. I asked why my grandfather never told anyone. Richard said I don't know. Some people are private about their finances. I said even with family. He said especially with family. I thanked him. He said if you need help settling the estate we can assist. I said I'll let you know. I sat in my car. I called the brokerage firm. I explained the situation. They said they needed documentation. I said I have a death certificate. They said that's a start. They said I'd need to open an estate account and provide letters of administration. I said how do I get those? They said through probate court. I said okay. They said the account is still active. I said how much is in it? They said we can't disclose that without authorization. I said I understand. I drove home. I didn't call my parents. I didn't call my sister. I just started researching probate law. I learned that without a will everything goes through the court. I learned that assets get distributed to next of kin. My grandfather's only child was my father, which meant my father was the legal heir, which meant everything would go to him, unless someone contested it. I thought about the properties, the stocks, the bank account. Altogether it was over $1 million. Maybe more. And my father said it was garbage. He gave my sister $50,000 in cash and told me I was selfish for wanting old documents. I made a decision. I wasn't going to tell them. Not yet. I was going to wait. I was going to let them think they got everything. I was going to let my sister open her boutique. I was going to let my parents congratulate themselves. And then I was going to file for probate. But first I needed to understand something. I needed to know if my father actually didn't know or if he was hiding it. So I called him. I said, "Hey, Dad." He said, "Hey." I said I was looking through grandfather's documents. He said, "Okay." I said, "Did you know he owned property in Oregon?" He said, "What?" I said, "There's a deed here." He said, "Let me see it." I said, "I'm not home right now." He said, "Well, I don't know anything about Oregon." He said, "It's probably from before I was born." I said, "Maybe." He said, "Why does it matter?" I said, "Just curious." He said, "Those documents are worthless." I already told you. I said, "Okay." He said, "Are you still upset about the money?" I said, "No." He said, "Good. Your sister really needs it." I said, "I know." Then I hung up. He had no idea. He actually thought it was worthless, which meant he never looked closely. He just saw old papers and assumed they didn't matter. My sister called me 2 days later. She said I'm looking at retail spaces. I said that's great. She said mom and dad are helping me with the lease. I said with the 50,000. She said yeah. I said good luck. She said you don't sound happy for me. I said I am. She said it doesn't seem like it. I said I'm just busy. She said you're always busy. I said yeah. She said whatever. Then she hung up. I filed for probate 3 weeks later. I submitted the death certificate. I submitted the property deeds. I submitted the stock certificates. I submitted the bank statements. The clerk said this will take time. I said how much time? She said a few months. I said okay. She said you'll receive notice when the hearing is scheduled. I said thank you. I didn't tell anyone. I went to work. I went home. I acted normal. My parents invited me to dinner. I went. My sister talked about her boutique the entire time. She said she signed a lease. She said she was ordering inventory. My mother said we're so proud of you. My father said this is what family investment looks like. My sister looked at me. She said some people just take. I smiled. I said you're right. 2 months passed. I got a notice in the mail. Probate hearing scheduled. I was listed as petitioner. My father was listed as interested party, which meant he'd get a notice too. 3 days later my father called. He was yelling. He said what the hell did you do? I said what do you mean? He said I got a notice from probate court. I said okay. He said you filed a petition. I said yes. He said for what? I said for grandfather's estate. He said there is no estate. I said actually there is. He said what are you talking about? I said those documents you gave me were in garbage. He went quiet. I said grandfather owned 3 properties. He had stocks. He had bank accounts. He said that's impossible. I said it's not. He said how much? I said over $1 million. He didn't say anything. I said hello. He said you're lying. I said I have documentation. He said send it to me. I said no. He said what do you mean no? I said you'll see it at the hearing. He hung up. My mother called 5 minutes later. She was crying. She said how could you do this? I said do what? She said go behind our backs. I said I didn't go behind anyone's back. She said you filed legal documents without telling us. I said I don't have to tell you anything. She said he was my father-in-law. I said and he was my grandfather. She said you're doing this because you're jealous of your sister. I said this has nothing to do with her. She said you've always been jealous. I said believe what you want. Then I hung up. My sister sent me a text. It said you're a snake. I didn't respond. Then she called. She was screaming. She said I already spent some of that money. I said I know. She said I signed a lease. I said I know. She said what am I supposed to do? I said that's not my problem. She said yes it is. You're ruining my life. I said no I'm protecting what's mine. She said it's not yours. I said we'll see. Then I hung up. I hired a lawyer. His name was David. He reviewed everything. He said you have a strong case. I said good. He said your father will try to argue that as the son he's entitled to everything. I said can he do that? He said he can try. But you have documentation showing assets he claimed didn't exist. That shows negligence at minimum. I said what does that mean for me? He said it means the court might award you a portion as compensation. I said how much? He said hard to say. Could be half. Could be more. Depends on the judge. I said okay. He said are you sure you want to do this? Your family will never forgive you. I said they gave my sister everything and called me selfish. He said fair enough. The hearing was 4 weeks away. During that time my family stopped talking to me completely. My father sent one email. It said you're making a huge mistake. The assets belong to me as the sole heir. You will lose in court and you will lose your family. I didn't reply. My sister posted on social media about her boutique. She said dreams coming true. So grateful for family support. People commented congratulations. I scrolled past it. 2 weeks before the hearing my aunt called. She said I heard what's happening. I said okay. She said your father is devastated. I said I'm sure he is. She said he really didn't know about those properties. I said then he should have looked harder. She said you're being cruel. I said I'm being fair. She said this will destroy your relationship. I said it already is destroyed. She hung up. The day of the hearing I wore a black suit. I got there early. David met me outside. He said ready. I said yes. We walked in. My father was already there with his lawyer. My mother sat next to him. My sister sat on the other side. They all stared at me. I sat down across the aisle. The judge came in. Everyone stood. She said this is regarding the estate of the deceased. She looked at the file. She said the petitioner claims there are undisclosed assets. She looked at my father. She said, is this correct? My father's lawyer stood up. He said, Your Honor, my client was unaware of any significant assets. The judge said how much was distributed. The lawyer said $50,000 in cash. The judge said to whom? He said to one of the granddaughters. The judge looked at me. She said, and you received? I said nothing, Your Honor. She said, why? The lawyer said the petitioner was deemed financially stable. The judge looked at my father. She said, did you inventory your father's belongings? He said, yes. She said, thoroughly. He said, I thought so. She said, you thought so. He nodded. She said, but you didn't verify the documents. He said they looked old and expired. She said, did you contact anyone to confirm? He said, no. The judge said, so you distributed $50,000 without confirming the total estate value. He said, I didn't think there was more. She said, that's not an answer. My father looked down. My lawyer stood. He presented the property deeds, the stock certificates, the bank statements, the letter from the law firm. The judge reviewed everything. She asked if the properties had been appraised. David said yes. He handed her the reports. She read them. She said combined value is $1.2 million. My mother gasped. My sister put her head in her hands. The judge said the brokerage account is currently valued at $130,000. The dormant bank account holds $32,000. She said total estate value is approximately $1.4 million. She looked at my father. She said, you called these documents garbage. He said, I made a mistake. She said, that's clear. She said, I'm freezing this estate. She said, I'm appointing an independent executor to review all distributions and transactions. She said, if there was intentional concealment, there will be consequences. My father's lawyer said, Your Honor, my client acted in good faith. The judge said good faith requires diligence. She said this hearing is adjourned. We'll reconvene after the executor's report. Then she left. My father turned around. He looked at me. His face was red. He said, you just destroyed this family. I stood up. I said, you destroyed it when you chose her over me. Then I walked out. David followed me. He said that went well. I said, what happens now? He said the executor will investigate. They'll review the cash distribution. They'll interview everyone. Then they'll make a recommendation. I said, how long? He said 2 to 3 months. I said, and then? He said, then the judge decides how to split everything. That night my phone exploded. My father called 15 times. My mother left voicemails crying. My sister sent texts calling me every name she could think of. I turned my phone off. I sat in the dark. I thought about my grandfather. I thought about all the afternoons we spent together. I thought about how my parents were never there, how my sister never cared, and I thought about how they called me selfish for wanting something that was his. 2 months later, the executor's report came. David called me. He said, you need to sit down. I said, why? He said, the executor found something. I said, what? He said, your grandfather had a handwritten note. It wasn't a legal will, but it expressed his wishes. He wanted his assets divided equally between both granddaughters. I felt my chest tighten. I said, equally. He said, yes. I said, so my sister gets half. He said, technically, yes. But there's more. He said the note specifically mentioned that you spend the most time with him, that you cared for him, and that if one granddaughter showed greater need, the division could be adjusted. I said, what does that mean? He said the executor is recommending 70-30. 70% to you, 30% to your sister. I said, why? He said, because your sister already received $50,000 in cash that should have gone through probate. That will be deducted from her share. I said, so what does she actually get? He said about $370,000 after the deduction. I said, and me? He said about $980,000. I didn't say anything. David said the hearing is next week. The judge will likely approve the recommendation. I said, okay. He said, your family is going to fight this. I said, let them. The final hearing was quiet. My father tried to argue. The judge cut him off. She said the executor's findings are clear. She said the estate will be divided as recommended. She said the $50,000 already distributed will be deducted from the younger granddaughter's share. My sister started crying. My mother held her. The judge said this estate is now settled. She looked at my father. She said, next time do your due diligence. Then she closed the file. I walked out. My family didn't follow me. I got in my car. I sat there for a minute. Then I drove home. 3 weeks later, the money was transferred. I paid off my house. I put the rest in investments. I didn't buy anything extravagant. I didn't post about it. I just lived my life. My sister closed her boutique 6 months later. She couldn't afford it after paying back part of the 50,000. My parents stopped speaking to me entirely. My father sent one final email. It said, I hope you're happy. You got what you wanted and lost your family. I deleted it. A year later, my aunt reached out. She said your father had a health scare. I said, I'm sorry to hear that. She said, he's asking for you. I said, no. She said, he's your father. I said, he stopped being my father when he called me selfish. She said, you're really not going to forgive him. I said, no. She hung up. I don't regret it. People ask me if I feel guilty. I don't. They gave my sister all the cash. They called me selfish. They handed me documents they thought were worthless. I didn't argue. I just waited. I let every lie come out on its own. My grandfather raised me. He taught me patience. He taught me to pay attention. And he left me something they tried to throw away. If you were in my place, would you have done the same?